To truly understand this whole crazy story, I think it's necessary to backtrack for a moment and fill in some of the gaps of the previous video. I had briefly mentioned some of the tripod marks on the ground at these mutilation sites, and had later shown some photos of a potential craft associated with the matter. The connection of the tripod marks is important because it's the exact dimensions of the imprints that reappear at countless other mutilation sites across great spans of time and space. Is it just a coincidence? I'll discuss the tripod marks themselves, along with what's attached to them later in the video. But for the moment, I think it's important to backpedal to where this story really started to blossom. In 1976, New Mexico State Police officer Greg Valdez received his first call near the Jicarilla Apache Native American Reservation to Manuel and Edmund Gomez's ranch about a strange cattle mutilation. The son, Edmund, would eventually become a key player in understanding more of the truth about Dulce. This was primarily due to the ranch's location and how it merged into native reservation land. It practically gave the Gomez family free rein to explore the Archuleta Mesa and mountain, which is exactly what Edmund did while living there. This was a privilege that, unfortunately, others like Greg Valdez and his associates like Dr. Howard Burgess wouldn't have, since they weren't residents or tribal members. Although he wasn't a local, Gabe was highly trusted by members of the tribe and community in Dulce, and would explore the reservation with at least one tribal officer or fish and game officer on numerous occasions. According to his son Greg, it was reported that people would often only feel comfortable calling Gabe when they wanted to report either a strange mutilation or an abduction experience. Upon reaching the location of the dead animal, the men had also noticed these bizarre triangular forming imprints on the ground and had taken note of something else that I had personally found to be strangely fascinating. Dr. Burgess and Officer Valdez had taken a keen interest in this unknown oily yellowish substance that caused skin irritation when touched and seemed to be inexplicably tied to the tripod imprints. What's more about these mutilations is that the animals seem to be temporarily moved from their original location, or at least picked up and restrained as the mutilation occurred. Even though this was the general rule across the country, judging by observations over the years and for what I know about life, there's always an exception to the rule. This exception was observed in New Mexico, conveniently enough near the Jicarilla Reservation, where a rancher had reported that his cow had survived an attempted mutilation. Allegedly, the cow had both of its ears completely missing when the rancher found it up and stumbling around still. Unfortunately, that cow had succumbed to its injuries soon after it was found and reported to investigators. Although it wasn't known where or how these animals were exactly mutilated, many aspects can still be explained through scientific and professional forensic analysis, along with circumstantial evidence gathered from a litany of sources. One of the main aspects that I wanted to cover pertaining to these mutilations has to deal with the government-tied theories that people like Greg Valdez and Tex Graves had come up with during their intense police investigations in New Mexico and Colorado. It says a lot when even seasoned law enforcement veterans, who are unfortunately no longer with us today, had struggled to rationalize how these animals were feasibly killed at the time. In essence, the men, along with other investigators like Edmund Gomez, believed that the animals had to have been secretly transported to covert laboratories and potential underground bases near mutilation sites to conduct the entire operation and dissect the live cattle without any interruption from outside factors and possible witnesses. There are repeated references to the Animal Investigation Program, which concluded in the 1980s and was publicly stated to be focused primarily around the Nevada test site. This experimental program is being mentioned to bolster the speculative notion that all these complex mutilations were being conducted from behind the sterile closed doors of top-secret laboratories. I will discuss how the AIP and the NTS are intertwined with this story later in the video, as the government did do some morbid yet publicly available research into cattle and the effects of nuclear radiation on them. Interestingly, At the first mutilation site in 1976, Manuel Gomez, the father of Edmund, had informed Officer Valdez about how it appeared that the craft had returned to the site of the dead cow to retrieve an ear. Mr. Gomez had only noticed this because there had been a partial tripod imprint made over his tire tracks from the previous day when he had come back to look at the carcass initially with his truck. This, in my view, makes the transportation of the cattle to various laboratories seem less probable, but not impossible with enough resources and coordination. Unfortunately, the Gomez family would go on to lose 17 of their animals on their ranch, including a horse. As I've discussed previously, it looked like the animals were restrained, according to authors like Greg Bishop and Greg Valdez, as there were clamp-like ligature marks found around many of the cattle's legs, which, interestingly enough, when the news of the ligature marks became public, the clamp marks had reportedly begun to show up in more inconspicuous portions of the body when they were forensically analyzed. Some of these cattle had shattered all of their bones somehow despite being in the middle of a flattened desert on private property. The evidence suggested that the cattle were likely dropped from a substantial height to receive the kind of internal structural damage that their skeletal frames sustained. Some cattle had been left dangling from fences and trees. Alternatively, in some cases, the corpses had even given the appearance of a semi-hollowed out piece of cowhide embedded with shattered bones that was simply left draped over one of the rancher's barbed wire fencing. Another yet highly important piece of the puzzle was how the animals were being drained of blood. It was purported that after investigators skinned the neck of one of these mutilated cattle, they were able to identify 2 large needle marks along the jugular vein and carotid artery of the cow. These puncture wounds were thought to utilize their natural heart's functions against their bodily autonomy as a siphoning system to have the cattle easily pump out their own blood. What's perhaps just as intriguing as what people can see on the macro level are the things that were observed by investigators on the microscopic level. Before I continue, I would like to note that I still struggle with comprehending this portion of the whole story, even though it's as vital as the mysterious aircraft and lights associated with it. If there is any portion of this video that might sound vague or confusing regarding this whole subject, then it will probably be this portion. Regardless, practically all of the cattle that were mysteriously mutilated several decades ago in at least the western United States had some kind of connection to harvesting organs tied to the lymph node system. Moreover, Officer Valdez and others like him, such as Harry Lynn Tex Graves, had ordered the cattle to be analyzed at locations like the Los Alamos National Laboratories and select universities. Upon further examination of the mutilated cattle found in the 1970s and 80s, it appeared that many of them would test positive for a strain of blackleg, which is structurally similar to anthrax and is most commonly caused by Clostridium shavoi. At the time, Los Alamos had informed Officer Valdez that it was an unidentified strain located in the heart chambers of these cattle. What's more is that in later years, during the late 1990s, when the National Institute of Discovery Sciences was founded by Robert Bigelow and became involved in the mess, he had hired Valdez as a field investigator, and Gabe had quickly come to realize that the purpose of the mutilations was shifting as time had passed. When Gabe returned to investigating the mutilations just as a private citizen from the NIDS, he and others from this intelligence gathering organization were able to determine that the mutilations were being conducted at that time based on some kind of clandestine research into prion diseases like mad cow and chronic wasting disease. As a quick side note, both of these diseases are highly interesting and will receive an individual video at a later date discussing them at greater depth. But in short, they are some of the closest real-world examples to zombism, and any slim possibility of animal-to-human transmission should terrify anyone, especially if the two diseases were to be altered and combined as a bioweapon with maybe the addition of something like rabies. It would create literal Hollywood movie zombies. Always remind yourself that reality is far stranger than fiction. To get back to the microscopic observations on the mutilated cattle, an important aspect that made them so bizarre was the decomposition rate that I discussed in the first video. Countless reports have been listed where dead bugs were found all over the carcasses, which is highly abnormal for a site of any deceased creature. Usually, in the forensic entomology world, when animals die, the site becomes a breeding ground for a plethora of insects to feed on and lay their eggs or larvae, unless the carcass was poisoned or highly irradiated. A deceased animal should never act as a cemetery for our world's insects and decomposers. When samples of the organs that remained were analyzed in the 70s and 80s, it was found that the cattle had contained exceedingly high amounts of vitamin B12 in their systems, along with high levels of potassium. To understand why vitamin B12 is important, we would first have to know about how cobalt and ion exchange are involved. Cobalt can be a very dangerous chemical element, yet if used properly, it can have numerous beneficial applications. Cobalt-60, for instance, is utilized medicinally to aid those who require radiation therapy, and can be prescribed as implants or even as external radiation therapy depending on the situation of a patient. But on the other hand, the cobalt-60 isotope is also produced as a result of nuclear fallout and is found in spent nuclear fuel. Ion exchange is important as it is a reversible chemical reaction in which dissolved ions are separated from a particular polymer solution and then are exchanged with other ions of the same or similar electrical charge. Ion exchange is extensively used in the process of atomic decontamination to remove radioactive contaminants such as fission and neutron activation products, and as a result, it produces a bead-like resin, often found in this story. All of this is mentioned very briefly just to say that the cattle were highly irradiated, yet not in the typical way that people would assume regarding radiation. Vitamin B12 contains cobalt, and investigators found exceedingly high levels of cobalt in the intestinally absorbed remains of the samples. It should go without saying, but ion exchange resin was also identified in some of the cattle, which in my opinion was left to mask the intense amounts of radiation that these cattle were likely experiencing as they were being mutilated. Since we are on the topic of radiation, many older cows that were autopsied had tested positive with high levels of plutonium-239 in their bones, along with other associated nuclear isotopes. The radioactive aspects of these mutilations were eventually thought to be why specific ages of livestock were chosen in certain areas at specific times throughout the decades. Depending on the age of the animals, it would be far less likely to find excessive amounts of radioactive material in younger specimens. This point of radioactive isotopes invading the bodies of these mutilated animals will come into play in a moment. And the mammary glands and udders were regularly removed with precision and were missing from the cattle when the carcasses were found. Keep in mind that the Animal Investigation Program had correlated its study of cow's milk with radioiodine levels. Scientists and associated veterans conducted a detailed analysis of these milk samples across decades in an attempt to monitor the commercial milk supply and potential thyroid poisoning as a result of nuclear fallout. In one instance, it was reported that a gas mask and an altitude gauging device had been found near a mutilated cattle. It should also be noted that radar reflection chaff, ordinarily utilized in military aircraft operations, had also been found near many of the mutilation sites. For those of you unaware, chaff refers to the material made of either small, thin aluminum strips, glass-coated aluminum, or plastic that's dispersed in the air to create a cloud that is meant to confuse enemy radar systems. These shavings could range in size from 1/4 of an inch to 2 inches long. There had also been a report of an entire unused bag of this radar reflecting chaff being found shoved into the throat of a dead calf. It wasn't until the late 1990s that people like Greg Valdez and others from the NIDS would theorize that the cattle were likely being killed through the administration of potassium chloride, hence the high levels of potassium I mentioned earlier. Unlike the mutilations in the 70s and 80s with the oily yellowish substance, the 90s showed a shift to a blue gel-like liquid being found on the carcasses. This gel was actually identified by the NIDS as embalming fluid on the cattle. Unfortunately, though, I was never able to find anything that would indicate what the oily yellowish substance was. Another difference between the mutilations across the decades is that the mutilations in the 90s had showed more interest in directed energy weapons research. The NIDS and Gabe had found numerous cattle during that time which appeared to have severe burn marks along the entire backs of the cattle. They were burned so badly, in fact, that the skin and muscle underneath it had been unironically completely cooked. Don't worry though, I will discuss the NIDS and its associated members of the aviary group later. One thing I also thought was strange as I kept digging more into these mutilations was that it seemed that they had slowed to a complete stop when Special Agent Kenneth Rommel from the FBI had come onto the scene to conduct his investigations. It's almost as if someone had been informed that an official government investigation was underway and had just kept a low profile until Agent Rommel left. After concluding his short, sanctimonious yet loose investigation, Agent Rommel took a public stance stating that the killings were nothing more than animal predation and botched organ harvesting by poachers and attention seekers. I want to emphasize the point that cattle were not the only animals being strangely mutilated, as Greg Valdez had also gone on numerous calls to strange elk and deer mutilations. I suppose that the majority of the other bizarre animal mutilations don't get reported as often as the cattle incidences do, since most of the smaller animals are found long after they've died or are not found at all. They're also perhaps not owned privately. Before we move on, I would like to touch on perhaps one last thing that directly pertains to the mutilations. When I began my research on all this initially, I'd always wondered how the cattle were being selected, if they even were, for mutilation. As it turned out, only certain herds of livestock and age ranges from them were typically being chosen. This, in my view, made picking out the specific animals to be an even more difficult task, especially when observing herds of cattle at a great distance. Remind yourself that nothing has ever been observed mutilating these cattle. Thankfully, investigators like Edmund Gomez and Greg Valdez had also pondered this dilemma and decided to test out some theories they had. The theory that confirmed their suspicions was over the usage of ultraviolet lights. In short, these cattle had been secretly marked with an invisible ink that would then be used to easily pick out the animals for mutilation by focusing an ultraviolet light sensor or black light on the pre-marked cattle. Greg Bishop notes in his book, Project Beta, that the investigators in Dulce, like Officer Valdez and Edmund Gomez, had gathered a herd of cattle one night and funneled them through a small corral where each cow would walk underneath different wavelengths of light fixtures. When some of the cattle walked under the ultraviolet light, the sides and backs would shine a bluish purple color. I suppose the best way I could explain this would be like if you shined a black light while walking in the desert and it eventually hovered over a scorpion. It would illuminate the insect in the dark to appear neon green. This is a similar premise. The newfound knowledge of this detection method back then had become a tremendous help to ranchers, particularly around Dulce and the New Mexico area. Once the news had spread, some men were able to catch numerous pre-marked cattle and other livestock through the use of this ultraviolet light detection. Many individuals were from bloodlines that predated the town of Dulce, and by selling their pre-marked, permanently inked cattle, the ranchers were at least able to save their money and stick it to whatever entity was causing this growing issue. I'm aware that all of this story thus far sounds very bizarre, but this is the information I have gathered, and I'm just paying it forward to you. In the end, it seemed to many credible investigators that the mutilations had been a result of multiple covert germ or biological warfare operations, as well as secret atomic weapons research and development. Regardless of the year or state in which these mutilations would occur, a common denominator would always be the evidence that some sort of aircraft had been present at the mutilations.
Are victims of alien abduction.
Ranchers have looked me straight in the eye and have told me about the beam of light that they saw come out of something up in the sky. They didn't know what it was.
The main things that have been reported with us are the UFO-type lights that appear and strange noises that people hear in the area. The most unusual thing is the UFO-type objects.